Genetically modified organisms improving the food system. Let's start by taking a look at what GMOs are anyways. A genetically modified organism is any organism whose genetic material has been altered using genetic engineering techniques. So why do we produce GM foods? GM foods are developed and marketed because there is some perceived advantage either to the producer or the consumer of these foods. This is meant to translate into a product with a lower price and greater benefit. The main objective of the use of GM crops is crop protection through the introduction of resistance against plant diseases caused by insects or viruses or through increased tolerance towards herbicides. These crops are made resistant by incorporating a gene from the Bt bacterium and their herbicide-tolerant HT properties. So the question is, are they safe? Let's take a look at some of the main concerns. The first of these concerns is allergies. The transfer of genes from commonly allergenic organisms to non-allergic organisms is discouraged unless it can be demonstrated that the protein product of the transferred gene is not allergenic. Currently, no allergic effects have been found relative to GM foods on the market. Genetic contamination is another of these concerns. Gene transfer from GM foods to human cells or to bacteria in the gastrointestinal tract through transgene escape, and the migration of genes from GM crops into conventional crops or into wild population through genetic drift are two forms of this concern. Some believe that it's just more money to corporations. They argue that GM crops are simply a means by which corporations make a greater profit. The same companies that create and patent GMO technology are the same companies that develop the pesticides and herbicides from which GM crops have become resistant to. Now you might be wondering, are there any benefits to GM crops? Let's take a look. As previously mentioned, GM crops have increased insect and virus resistance, decreasing the use of harmful pesticides. GM crops have also allowed farmers to grow more crops on less land and with less water. Because they require fewer pesticides and use less land and water, GMOs help keep food production costs down, resulting in lower prices for consumers. Because of the greater yields and lower prices, GM crops can help to feed people around the world, especially in developing countries. So do these benefits outweigh the potential consequences? The answer is yes. Despite the many arguments against the use of GM crops, the evidence of the benefits of their use are too numerous to disregard. In order to deal with climate change and the world's growing population, GM crops seem to be one of the most promising approaches. It would be a missed opportunity not to capitalize on the benefits of GM crops. In order to do this, the use of proper government regulation is needed to mandate the way in which GM crops can be produced and consumed to ensure their safety. Canada is currently the third largest producer of GMOs in the world. In 1993, the Canadian government established the Federal Regulatory Framework for Biotechnology. The framework established that rather than creating new regulations, novel products produced through biotechnology would be regulated under the existing regulations that cover traditional products. In Canada, GMOs used either as food or animal feed must be approved before entering the market. This process is based on numerous regulations that are enforced by Health Canada for foods, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency for seeds and livestock feed, and Environment Canada for new substances intended for environmental release. Approvals for GMOs are required for both locally produced and imported products. So what about labeling? Canada currently does not have policies requiring mandatory labeling of GMOs. By implementing such a policy, GM crops can continue to be produced and sold while informing the public of what has been modified and what has not. Farmers should have the choice whether or not to grow GM crops, and consumers should have the choice of whether to purchase them or not. To conclude, after analyzing the evidence surrounding the socioeconomic aspects of the use of GM crops, it is clear that the risks associated with their use are comparatively small and outweighed by the benefits. With the use of government regulations and proper labeling, GM crops can prove to be very beneficial to the agricultural industry as a whole and in turn to society. So, what do you think?
Created using Powtoon.